The year is 1933. Everyone moves at a rate of 18 frames per second, and there is a spectre haunting Europe. The spectre of fascism. Socialist and anarchist movements across the continent had collapsed, and the pendulum of revolution had begun its ominous swing to the other side. A certain ex-communist named Benito Mussolini had been ruling Italy for over a decade, whilst his former comrades were murdered or thrown in jail. The Catholic conservatives were making sweeping gains in the Second Spanish Republic, and the brutal dictatorship of a little-known brigadier named Francisco Franco was soon to follow. Of course, we all know how this story ended. The forces of fascism and freedom locked horns in the free marketplace of ideas, or Normandy, and with the iron wit of Winston Churchill at the helm, this triggered vegetarian painter was once and for all destroyed with facts and logic. But I'm not here to tell you about that, because Britain's war on fascism wasn't just a war on Germany, although that's what Churchill always called it, because Britain also experienced a fascist rising that it had to defeat at home. Part 1. Fascism in the UK. In the same year that Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, an adorable infant and future Queen of the nation named Elizabeth was being taught the Sieg Heil salute by her fascist uncle, King Edward VIII. Lord Viscount Rothermere, owner of the Daily Mail newspaper, wrote several articles in defence of the newly formed Nazi regime, and of Hitler's aspiring British equivalent, Sir Oswald Mosley. The Daily Mirror, a famously left-wing publication, did the same, and even hosted a beauty contest in search of Britain's prettiest fascist woman. Even the ex-Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who led Britain in the First World War, gushingly said that Hitler was the greatest German of the age. And it wasn't just political backing the Nazis were being offered by these corners of the British upper class, they were given intellectual backing too. Eugenics had been hinted at since the days of Plato, but the term itself wasn't coined until 1883, not by a German, but by a Brit. The cousin of Charles Darwin, no other, Francis Galton, who had formed the idea after developing an obsession with a chapter in Origin of Species that discussed the selective breeding of domestic animals. Woven into the theory of eugenics was the study of race. In his book entitled Hereditary Genius, Galton implores us to do what we can to encourage the multiplication of the races best fitted to invent and to conform to a high and generous civilization. The Eugenics Education Society had university branches all over the country, and their influence often extended to Parliament itself. In 1910, long before he decided to single-handedly tell other people to go and kill all the Nazis for him, the ultimate Antifa warrior himself, Winston Churchill, issued a memo to the Prime Minister where he cautioned,
"At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them."
In April 1933, the Union Debating Society of the Scottish Elite University of St Andrews put forward the notion, "This House approves of the Nazi Party and congratulates it on its splendid work in the reformation of Germany." The motion was passed with a resounding yes. The free marketplace of ideas had spoken, and fascism was very much the new counterculture. But unlike in Germany, the fascists in the UK never took power. Well, why not, I'm so glad you asked. If you ask a typical British pundit this question, they'll usually respond with something like, "You see, the British people have always been endowed with a sense of moderation. There is an essence of the British character that is stable, pragmatic, less susceptible to the chaos of revolutionary extremes." I should remind you this is the same nation that conquered and plundered a quarter of the globe whilst also inventing concentration camps, but that's just by the by. And as we've just seen, a good section of the British elites were far from politically moderate. They were ready for fascism. The king was ready for fascism. And while they were reassuring themselves that the facts and science were on their side and that Hitler's anti-Semitism was probably just trolling, the working classes of Britain were also humouring a not-so-moderate idea of their own, the idea of communism. As we're about to see, the rise and fall of fascism in the UK had everything to do with extreme ideology, and the extreme determination of both sides involved. In the 1930s, Oswald Mosley had high hopes for his party, the British Union of Fascists, and he spent the decade trying to establish strongholds in major cities up and down the country. In this video, I'm going to be talking about events surrounding the BUF in one of their most important target cities, the small coastal town of Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland. Between 1936 and 1939, Aberdeen was the centre of fascist activity in Scotland and arguably the whole of the UK. The events that occurred in this period will be the subject of this video, and I'm doing this for a few reasons. Firstly, this is the town I grew up in. I also thought it would be good to take an example from Scotland, because it seems like our only representation on political YouTube so far has been from a fascist Furby and the single most depressing entity in the entire known universe. But mostly I think this story contributes in its own little way to the argument about how fascism should be dealt with. Now, the issue that usually splits people here is one of free speech. And there are questions you can ask like, should we prepare ourselves with arguments to debunk fascist talking points? Or do we stamp them out quickly so we can focus on more interesting questions like, how do we reduce poverty? How do we improve the health service? How many genders did it take to destroy ancient Rome? The thing about conversations like this is they can often feel a bit disconnected and quite hypothetical. So I thought I would do something a little different and give a historical example of how these struggles played out instead. This whole video won't be much of an attempt to persuade you of anything, but rather just to share something that I think is quite a rare gem in history. Leading the fascists in this story was a man called William Keith Abercrombie Jock Chambers Hunter, Laird of Tillery near Udney, and in-law descendant of the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa. Leading the opposition was a young pawnbroker apprentice called Bob Cooney. Part 2. Fascism in Aberdeen. In the summer of 1934, the British Union of Fascists suffered two major setbacks. The first was because of an outbreak of violence that occurred at the famous rally at Olympia in London. The second was barely 3 weeks later on the night of the Long Knives, when Hitler sanctioned the murder of 90 of his Nazi colleagues in Germany. Mosley lost a lot of his media support, but he had now managed to absorb the support of several smaller fascist parties of the time. In 1936, he adopted a new strategy to concentrate fascist strength in key areas. This was when they targeted the growing fascist stronghold of Aberdeen. Urban legend has it that the university building of Marischal College in Aberdeen was Hitler's favourite building in the UK, and that he had planned to use it as his British residence after he had won the war. But there were a few other reasons Aberdeen was appealing to the fascists. Firstly, Chambers Hunter was a relentless campaigner, and he was well resourced due to his title and his connection to the elites in South Africa. But probably most importantly, despite its relatively high population, the city is very small, and the high unemployment rates of the 1930s meant the streets were always busy, with people out of work, who were especially vulnerable to fascist propaganda. In 1936, the Aberdeen branch was awarded with the Oswald Mosley Cup, when they sold more papers than any other district in the UK. By 1937, the fascists had enjoyed a considerable increase in membership, literature sales, attendance at policy classes, as well as a spread of influence across the rest of Scotland. With their newfound confidence, the fascists started to seek out larger venues for their gatherings. In February 1937, they planned an open meeting in the local music hall with the BUF's Director of Policy, Raven Thompson, as the key speaker. But now that the fascists were making their presence known, they started to attract opposition, most of which came from the men and women of the Communist Party. When they heard about the music hall meeting, their plan was to attend the event themselves. The meeting was due to start at 7:30 in the evening, but by 6:30 it was clear that almost no one in the audience was there to listen. Obviously, the footage I'm using here is not from Aberdeen. This is from Dear White People, but the sentiment is pretty much the same. For a full hour, the communists filled the hall with shouting and singing, which only got louder as the speakers made their way to the platform. As Raven Thompson tried to persist with his speech and asked the crowd for silence, an activist stood up waving a red flag which set off a chorus of people singing an English rendition of the socialist anthem, The International. The chief constable, who was in no mood for starting a fight, announced to the organisers that the event was cancelled. The fascists left before the meeting could begin, and the communists celebrated by marching up the town thoroughfare and held their own rally in the Market Stance, a public square in the town centre. After the music hall event, the BUF were forced to adopt what was known as a hit-and-run strategy. This meant they had outdoor meetings which were quick and they were never advertised. Instead, Chambers Hunter would give impromptu speeches from his open-roof car, and the group would quickly disband before the opposition had time to respond. The events at the music hall did, however, manage to earn the fascists some sympathy. from the police. But with the urban landscape of Aberdeen being so compact, it was still hard for them to hold meetings without being followed, and an increasing number of anti-fascists were arrested as the campaign intensified. Even with the fascists resorting to small, last-minute gatherings, the determination of the communists and other anti-fascists to stop them was striking. Now, is this because left-wingers are all authoritarians and love punching people who disagree with them? No. Their response to the fascists can probably be explained a bit better by the geographical position of the city, which gave Aberdonians a unique insight into what was unfolding in Germany. Remember, Aberdeen is a coastal town, in which the locals would frequently come into contact with German docks workers, many of whom were socialists or trade unionists, in fear for their lives back home. They had seen firsthand how fascists were able to grow their movement, and how powerless the liberal state of the Weimar was to stop it. With the fascists enjoying protection from the police, and not to mention the British intelligentsia, the opposition often had to resort to very spontaneous and creative methods to frustrate Chambers Hunter's efforts. One of these activists, and I'm so happy I managed to find this story, was none other than my own great-great-uncle, a man named Jock. Jock was a cooper, who had lost several fingers in an industrial accident and had become well known for his tireless efforts selling copies of the Daily Worker. He would walk from one end of town to the other, often several times a day, where he would also spot Chambers Hunter doing the same, circulating copies of his own publication, Union. In a stunning act of praxis, Jock perfected the technique of following Chambers Hunter around, and every time Chambers Hunter tried to announce he was selling papers, Jock would shout over him. And sometimes this lasted all day. On one occasion, in the West End of Aberdeen, when Chambers Hunter confronted Jock, an altercation broke out, and witnesses heard Jock shouting the words, "Get out of my road!" as he snatched a bundle of papers from the fascist leader's hands, whilst kicking him and stamping on his feet. The local sheriff, who had been called to the scene, asked of Jock, "Do you use the same sales technique in the West End as you do in the East End?" To which Jock revealed a toothless smile and said, "No, my lord. When I go up to the West End, I put on my toffy accent to catch the sprats that wear the spats." I don't know what that means, but it ended with Jock getting 30 days in jail. Obviously, incidents like this made it very difficult for the fascists to get anything done, and they didn't earn many new recruits over this period. But in the summer of 1937, they chose to defy the communists and planned a rally at the market stance. The event was scheduled for a Sunday evening on the 25th of July. It was advertised on the evening before in a local newspaper with the heading, "Chambers Hunter will explain why Mosley will win." But many of the anti-fascists had jobs as tram and bus drivers. Word of the meeting spilled out quickly, and the Communist Party already had a rally planned on the same day at 11 a.m., 8 hours before the fascist event. Bob Cooney addressed the audience and curious passers-by, and the plan was simple: to arrive in the evening and fill the place with vocal opposition. They wrote the message down into the pavements using piped clay, sent telegrams, and others just walked across town, knocking on doors to spread the word. By the evening, around 2,000 people had turned up, and most of them were there to oppose the fascists. But this was where something very interesting happened. I should point out here that Market Stance is surrounded by a perimeter of residential buildings, and people didn't need permission to hold meetings or give speeches here, but the use of speakers and megaphones was forbidden. So, on this occasion, when the fascists arrived with Chambers Hunter and a large van that had been fitted with 4 loudspeakers, the police did nothing. The speakers were big enough that no amount of shouting would keep Chambers Hunter quiet this time, but with the police unwilling to stop them being used to enforce the rule that they themselves had put in place, the initiative was instead left to the anti-fascists. As Chambers Hunter started speaking, a member of the Communist Party named Duncan Robertson leapt onto the van as the crowd surrounded it. Robertson was quickly thrown off by the black shirts, but he emerged from the crowd with a fistful of severed cables and was immediately seized by the police. The speaker system was completely destroyed, but Chambers Hunter nonetheless spoke on for a full half hour, and nothing was heard. As he continued his speech, stones and other missiles were thrown towards him from the crowd, and the van was eventually escorted away by the police. 9 people had been arrested. The prisoners were eventually released on bail 5 days later, and Bob Cooney, who was amongst them, was warned that he would be held responsible for any further trouble caused by the communists. With that warning, he walked down to the market stance where a crowd was waiting for him. There, he gave his last speech before he left for Spain to fight against Franco's regime in the Civil War, a journey which George Orwell had embarked on a year earlier. Around this time, Chambers Hunter had gone back to his impromptu speeches. He wrote in his publication that they were being given a friendly reception by the local residents, and in the October of that year, they tried once more to hold a gathering at Market Stance, as part of a nationwide tour celebrating the 5th anniversary of the BUF. This time, they were allowed to arrive with a loudspeaker and a backup megaphone in a van which was now armoured and surrounded by 30 police officers. But their hopes of a peaceful fascist birthday celebration were soon squashed. The events of the summer seemed to have stirred an interest amongst the locals, and this time over 10,000 people arrived, and most of them counter-demonstrators. The event was already delayed just because of how long it took the van to get into the middle of the square, and the police were already ordered to use their batons to clear the way. By the time they reached the middle, even the loudspeakers weren't enough to rise above the sheer volume of the crowd. None of the speeches were heard, and the evening closed with the fascists being literally chased out of the city. This was the last time fascists ever attempted a planned public event in Aberdeen. Oswald Mosley made his only visit to the city a month after the market stance meeting, but there was no attempt to make any occasion of the day, and his initial plan to hire out the music hall was abandoned. Over the next year and a half, fascist activity started to die down. The rearmament of the British Army brought unemployment rates down, and the pool of potential fascist recruits was massively reduced. Chambers Hunter also started to lose sympathy from the police. The reasons for this are kind of obscure, but some have suggested it was down to his tendency to call the police bastards for refusing to protect him, even when the anti-fascists hadn't broken any laws. But by 1939, after putting up with Nazis invading European countries for a couple of years, Britain declared war on Germany, and the hopes of a fascist rising at home were dead. Chambers Hunter resigned from the BUF, and in 1940, the party was dissolved under emergency defence regulations. To this day, there has been no sign of fascism ever making a return in Aberdeen. Part 3. Thoughts. After the collapse of the Third Reich, it seemed the war against eugenics and ultranationalism was also decisively won at home. At the end of the war, in 1945, Churchill dubbed the British people the greatest generation that ever lived. 2 months later, they voted him out, giving a landslide victory to one of the most left-wing leaders in the nation's history. Aberdeen was once described by the BUF Director of Policy as the toughest town they have ever struck. Now, I imagine people will have mixed feelings about the actions of their opponents. When I think of Chambers Hunter trying to hold his head high and giving his half-hour speech that no one could hear, I can't help but feel a slight pang of sympathy. But I suppose it would be worth comparing what happened in Aberdeen to the way a very similar conflict played out in Germany. But first, because I can't help myself, here's some background. The German philosopher from the Frankfurt School, Walter Benjamin, wrote extensively on fascist movements across Europe in the 1920s and 30s. In his work, he observed that there were 3 main conditions that allowed fascism to flourish. Number 1, unemployment. 2, economic deflation. If you ever want to annoy your friends, you can use this graph explaining why the inflation thing is slightly inaccurate. And 3, the absence of a left-wing alternative. Let's look at that last point. Germany had a little known about revolution after their defeat in World War I. The German Empire had collapsed. Several major cities were being taken over by the workers, and a revolutionary government was formed alongside a national assembly. Barely a couple of years later, the movement was crushed by the German military, who were in alliance with, believe it or not, the centre-left Social Democratic Party? Bernie? In fact, it was none other than the Social Democratic Minister of the Interior, Gustav Noske, who agreed to set up a counter-revolutionary force of mercenaries known as the Freikorps. This was where a certain ancient Hindu symbol for good luck, known as the swastika, would make its first appearance in modern history, as it adorned the uniforms and banners of Freikorps troops. The Social Democratic Party. Not long before she was murdered by the Freikorps in 1919, the Polish Marxist and activist Rosa Luxemburg warned that bourgeois society stood at a crossroads, socialism or barbarism. It seemed Germany was already making its choice more than a decade before the Nazis came to power. With the left already weakened, events following the German Revolution would make matters even worse. In 1930, a 22-year-old Nazi stormtrooper was shot on his doorstep by a group of Communist Party members and died in hospital shortly after. His death was seized upon by the Nazis as a golden recruitment tool. They won over huge swathes of the German middle class by warning about the threat of Bolshevik violence, and they published pieces about how the left were an existential threat to the Weimar Republic.
Ironic.
The German left became more and more reluctant to show face in the public discourse, and this meant that discontented liberals on the fence were open for the taking. With diminished anti-fascist activity, the Nazis were able to expand their movement with very little friction, and the activists in Aberdeen knew full well where this led. While the police were interested in not just preserving but also amplifying the free speech rights of fascists, it became the duty of the left to stand in their way. Now we know what Clemenza was talking about in that scene from The Godfather.
You know, you gotta stop them at the beginning. Like they should have stopped Hitler at Munich. They should never let him get away with that. They was just asking for big trouble.
Aberdeen has now gone nearly 100 years without having to deal with fascism. In the same time, do you know what else they've never had to deal with? Antifa violence. And I think I can close here with a quote which I think sums up the whole thing pretty well. Shortly before he left for Spain, Bob Cooney was leaving prison when a police officer said, "I want to warn you, if there is any more trouble with the fascists, I'm going to put you all the way." Bob's reply was, "You'd better tell the fascists that. There was no trouble before the fascists came." Do you think it's hypocritical for a socialist to take money for doing a thing? Prove yourself right by supporting me on Patreon and nailed it.